Hey folks, and welcome back. This is Dungeons and Drybrushing. I'm Daniel, and today I've got a really cool one for you. A lot of you are probably already familiar with 5-room dungeons. If you're not, it's a way of organizing and creating dungeons as the DM that just helps you to get a workflow going, and if you're a beginner, it's a really useful design tool. And if you're an experienced DM, it can still actually be really good. This is still something I use time to time if I don't have an exact idea of what I want for a dungeon. Well, today, we're going to design a dungeon using the 5-room dungeon method, but better than that, we're going to craft the dungeon, and better than that, we're going to craft the entire dungeon using things that I picked up at the dollar store today. Now, when I went into the store, I had no idea what I was going to buy. I didn't even have a theme for the dungeon or anything like that picked out. I just sort of wandered the aisles. Anything that looked cool or useful or fun got put in the basket. Now, by the time I left, I did have some idea about what I wanted. I still haven't plotted or planned it. That's something that we're going to do here, now, together, as we build. Frankly, I'm pretty excited to see how it turns out. So let's dive in. While I get out all of my filthy dollar store loot, I want to go over the rules I'm going to be using. Now, the only construction materials I can use are from the dollar store. That's the stuff I bought today, including dollar store foam, but also things like toothpicks, for example, that I have roughly 10 billion of on hand. So I didn't buy them today, but that is where they came from. That's only for the construction materials, though. When it comes to paint, glue, and other adhesives, I'll just be using what I have on hand. Typically, I'll be sticking to craft paints and either PVA or hot glue. I won't be using any fancy tools like the airbrush or the hot wire cutter. The idea is to test if we can walk into a dollar store and walk out with a dungeon. I'm not going to undermine that by using expensive pieces of kit that not everyone has access to. Alright, that said, let's move on to planning the first room. The first thing any dungeon needs is a theme, and for my 5-room dollar store dungeon, I picked the theme of a cursed ancestral tomb. Not every room in a 5-room dungeon needs to be an actual physical space, it's just shorthand for an encounter or difficulty that the player characters face. It could be a monster, a trap, a puzzle, a locked door. It could even be a loot room in the dungeon. Now, personally, I like to start my 5-room dungeons with a social encounter, something to set the mood and the tone, and to let the players do some social roles and some role-playing early in the session to dig up extra information about the adventure. So we have to decide who is giving them the quest. A representative from the local adventure guild? A scholar with an academic interest in the curse and local lore? Or maybe a noblewoman from a rival noble house who wants the treasures inside for herself. For this one, I think I'm going to keep it simple and go with the scholar, who wants to know about the curse of the family. That might encourage the players to investigate the mystery as they go along. We also need to bait the players into the dungeon, so let's put a magic artifact inside, or at least the rumor of one. Player characters can never resist a magic item. And finally, let's work in those social roles. With a DC 12 insight check, our players can tell this scribe is being a bit shifty. And with a persuade or intimidate of 15, they'll spill the beans that rumors say said magic artifact is cursed. Okay, now we know what we're building, it's time to actually dig in and get started. Our social encounter is going to happen in a creepy old cemetery outside of the cursed ancestral mausoleum. This is our chance to set the scene and let the players know what they're in for. I start with some white foam board from the dollar store. I want the cemetery to look old and kind of run down and spooky, so I sketch in a broken up old cobble road that cuts through it, but's in a state of disrepair. The cobbles can just be drawn in by hand with a ballpoint pen and textured with a tinfoil ball. We'll worry about the texture of the rest of the ground later on. I want to give this a black base coat, and since I'm going to be using a lot of other glues on it later, and I don't want it to warp, Mod Podge is the way to go. It will help to seal the foam and prevent that warping. No fantasy graveyard is complete without some creepy grave markers and memorials, and these fairy garden pieces are going to be perfect for that. They're just distorted enough from reality, just weird enough looking to be unsettling. So I pick out my favorite ones and base coat them with black spray paint. But I'm going to need some plain grave markers and tombstones too, and the white foam is perfect for that. I'm not going to worry about elaborate shapes because that's covered by the fairy garden statues. I just cut some simple rectangles from foam. If you're doing this with scissors like I am, it will crush the edges of the foam a little, which for me adds to the crumbling stone look. And of course, these get textured with a foil ball just like all of the other stone pieces. The foam gravestones get a quick base coat in Mod Podge, and then it's time to start painting all of this stonework. The cobbles, the statues, and the gravestones all get the same stone treatment. Now, starting from black, I do a heavy dry brush with a medium gray, and once it's completely dry, I move on to a light dry brush of an off-white. After that, everything gets washed with black. That will add to the grimy, spooky, and dark sort of feeling that I want for the cemetery. This next step is why it's so important to get Mod Podge onto your board. Without it, this would have definitely warped the foam beyond the point of being usable. There are ways to fix that sometimes, but for me, the easiest method is to just not do it in the first place. Now for the ground cover, I spread PVA glue over the entire board except those cobbles. Then it's just regular old dirt. This is stuff I've had sitting around, ready to go forever, but if you're going out to the garden to grab some, make sure you bake it. An hour in the oven at 400 degrees will get rid of any bacterial contaminants. You don't want your craft growing its very own green ooze monster. And finally, I need an actual mausoleum for our wayward, macabre scholar to be standing outside of. This is going to be a relatively quick and simple construction from craft foam. I measure the walls to a roughly 2-inch height, but the rest of the measurements I take from the board itself. I want it to fit on the corner and sort of dominate the space, making it the focal point. The foam pieces get cut with an olfa knife. The paper backing on the foam gets peeled off on one side so that we can texture it, and then it gets hit with the foil ball to give us that lovely stone look. The walls of the mausoleum then get assembled very simply with hot glue. And now that I have the final size for the walls, I use them to measure and cut 2 identical triangles to start the roof from. The easy way to do this is just to cut one, then trace it onto the foam, and use that as your template for the second. Now they will be very slightly different, but for me, it just doesn't matter for an old, decrepit tomb. And after the tinfoil ball texturing, I hot glue these on as well. This is where things started to get a little dicey. I was able to use the cardstock backing from the fairy garden statues as the rest of the structure for the roof, which worked great. It was almost the perfect size. Normally I would just go to my stockpile of crafting materials to find more cardstock to make shingles out of. But I'm not actually allowed. None of that came from the dollar store, so it breaks the rules of the challenge. After thinking for a few minutes about alternatives, I decided to just go ahead and harvest the packaging from everything I bought for the challenge that has cardstock. I opened all of it and used that backing to cut strips of shingles and glue them to the roof. And in the end, I had just enough cardstock to make it work. Barely. If I need any more at all for the rest of the challenge, I don't actually know what I'm going to do, but that's future me's problem. He's a clever guy. I'm sure he'll be fine. It's probably. Whatever. From my leftover foam scraps, I carved a wooden door, drawing on some simple planks, and then cut a hole in the front of the mausoleum to inset it. While the mausoleum may lead into the depths of a dungeon, it should look relatively unassuming from the outside in an attempt to avoid exactly the kind of tomb robbing that our adventurers are about to get into. The problem of a door handle, which I hadn't planned for at all, but definitely needed, was solved by realizing that the Snow White toy I'd bought was actually a keychain, which means it has a little jewelry ring on the top. I simply unscrewed it, snipped off the part I didn't need, and attached it to the door. Before painting, everything naturally gets a Mod Podge base coat. That's not only going to seal the foam, but when you're dealing with all of these separate layers of shingles, it's a good idea to add extra glue when you can. Because some of my shingles had printing on them, I gave everything a darker black base coat after, just to make sure that the text wouldn't show through. Then it's on to painting. The mausoleum gets the same stone treatment that everything else did. Medium gray, light gray, and black wash. I wanted to stick with desaturated, creepy, aged colors so the door gets a very washed out brown and the roof gets a desaturated blue-gray. I also took the chance to try out some of the stencils I picked up, hoping to add a little detail to the stonework. Now if you're thinking it looks drab, don't worry, we'll be adding more color to the final piece very shortly. Now it's time for the really fun bit, getting everything in place and adding detail. This is where it all comes together, for better or worse. I start with a single decorative bead added to the mausoleum just to add some interest, and then everything starts to get glued into place. Finally, I can see the road, the cemetery, and the mausoleum all together. But I'm not done. I add some more PVA glue in random patches, and that gets covered up with the rougher, more coarse gravel that I picked up. I know it looks too shiny and stands out right now, but we'll fix that shortly. But first, no overgrown, abandoned graveyard is complete without some plant life. Trimmings from this pot of fake plants will go a long way to helping sell that this is an untended and uncared for place. I just snip off the appropriate parts and superglue them into place. Now this is where the magic happens that brings this all together as one scene. The dollar store doesn't have flock, so I'm pretty limited in what I can do for grass. But I can't just leave it all as dirt either. So I mix up 4 different combinations of oil paints. That's 1 dark brown, 1 green, 1 blue-green, and 1 black-green. And these just get dabbed over the entire board. It's gonna look chaotic and silly at first, and I won't lie, there was a minute where I thought I had just ruined my project. But it's one of those steps where you've gotta have faith and just trust the process and see it through. We're often our own biggest critics and the ones who are fastest to doubt ourselves and our own abilities. Having more trust in yourself is a skill, one we all falter in sometimes. But these oil paints get over every inch of the board, and I also cover the bottom of the statues and mausoleum with one of the green paints to help it look like moss has grown up over them in the damp of the graveyard. And that leaves us here. A finished mausoleum and a creepy graveyard for our adventurers to start their journey in. The nervous, beak-nosed scholar fitfully rubs his hands together as he uses an aged brass key to unlock the door. The mists of the cemetery flow down the set of stairs inside, leading away under the earth, beneath the damp ground in a graveyard, where all the corpses go. But no treasure was ever won easily. They light their torches and descend. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'd like to extend an even bigger thank you to my Patreon supporters who do so much to keep the channel together and working on cool projects like this. Thank you so much. Now if you liked this, please hit like and subscribe, or share this video with some friends who might be into it. It helps the channel a lot. And I'll be back soon with rooms 2 and 3 of the Dollar Store dungeon. I'll see you on the next one.